Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his posthumously published work, Offenses Against Oneself, Jeremy Bentham is looking at a number of different, viewed by some people, sexual offenses, and he's examining whether it actually makes sense to prohibit and to punish them. He's spending the bulk of his analysis on male-male homosexual relationships, and he begins by considering some of the very common reasons that get brought up in his own time, and I think even sometimes in our own time as well. So he's going to begin by looking at the issue in a utilitarian way, so in terms of pain and pleasure. He uses the word mischief, and by that he means the tendency to produce more pain than pleasure for people who are involved or affected. And he asks, is there any primary mischief there? So that means, do the people themselves that are engaging in it, are they having pleasure or pain? And remember, from a utilitarian perspective, you want to have a preponderance of pleasure over pain for the people involved or affected. And he says, well, no, they're not experiencing a lot of pain. They want to do this. This is a pleasurable act or set of acts for them if both partners are willing. If either is unwilling, he says, then we're not actually talking about the same thing. We're just discussing a sexual offense that we call rape, right? So if we're not talking about that, then there isn't any primary mischief. What about secondary mischief? He says, it doesn't produce any pain of apprehension or alarm in the community for what is there in it for anybody to be afraid of. And he will actually consider that a little bit later. Some people are very bothered by the fact that other people who aren't them are having male-male sexual relations. So maybe this is not the best argument on his part. And then he asks, is there any danger of example? This is something that gets brought up a lot in our time when people are talking about culture. He says, any danger exclusive of pain must consist in the tendency of the example. What's the tendency of the example? To dispose others to engage in the same practices. But this practice for anything that has not yet appeared produces not pain of any kind to anyone. So if somebody learns that men can have sex with each other and they're like, I think I'd like to do that, that's not actually a downside from Bentham's point of view because it's not producing pain for them. Then he's going to talk about reasons that have commonly been assigned. So most people don't look at this in a utilitarian point of view. They rely on other arguments. So there's really two main sets of arguments here. The first he's going to deal with fairly quickly, and the overall response to this is they're not actually making much sense when you ask them what they're actually talking about. So he says that the whole tribe of writers on English law, who none of them knows any more what they mean by the word peace than they do many of the other expressions that are most familiar to them, reckon this, male-male homosexual activity and relationships, as offenses against the peace. And so they also reckon forgery, coining, and all sorts of frauds against offenses against the peace. And Bentham is saying this is kind of an incoherent category. you could say that forging undermines the basis of society. How does this do that? And he says, it's not any old sexual offense that does that. It's doubted whether adultery be not a breach of the peace. It is certain whenever a gallant accepts an invitation of another man's wife, he does it with force and arms. And Bentham says this needs no comment. It's incoherent on their part. And then he says, now one particular legal authority, Blackstone, is more particular. He says it's not only an offense against the peace, but in the division of offenses against the peace, which are offenses against security, right? And he says if a person is guilty of this kind of activity, for instance, with a cow, it's an offense against someone's security, but he doesn't say whose security, right? For the law makes no distinction in its ordinances, so that's kind of a problem. You've got to clarify whose security. And he says that, so long as we're not talking about rape, there isn't any offense against somebody's security. And if we are talking about rape, well, that's very clear, and it doesn't pertain specifically to this. So those are pretty easy to get rid of. You're just asking the person who's like, homosexuality should be punished. Well, what the hell do you mean by offenses against the peace or against security? And they can't give you a proper answer. He says that another argument that's brought up that we could take more seriously has to do with what he calls debilitating effects, which he describes using an old-fashioned term, enervation or weakness. Enervation means like your body and your mind become weaker through something that happens. For example, if all you do is sit around on the couch and watch TV all day, that could be kind of enervating to your body because you're not actually using it. If you're constantly relying on caffeine to wake up, maybe that's enervating, right? And so the idea is that male-male sexual activity and relationships would be bad for the people who are undergoing them, are involved in them. And he says that Montesquieu actually brings this up. Why? He says, if this is true, it's a reason of a very different complexion from any of the preceding. It is on the ground of this reason as being the most plausible one. I've ranked the offense under its present head. So he says, we need to think about this then. If it's true, it would actually be an offense not just against yourself, weakening yourself. It would actually be an offense against the state or society that you live in. It would be making you less fit to be a member of society. Now, the question is, well, is it true? And he says if it's going to be true, it's going to have to be from habit, not a single act. So, merely discovering two guys together fooling around or something like that, that's really not enough to justify punishing on the basis of debilitating effects. You got to show that there's a habit there. But let's say you can. What arguments can you make? Because you still have to show that it is in fact debilitating. So how would you do that? One way would be by making arguments a priori, by referencing a science, that of physiology, that has to do with the human body. You'd have to show that the sort of activities that men engage with each other in sexual relationships are actually weakening their bodies. But he says, we don't see that from physiology. So if you're not going to argue a priori, how else can you argue? We sometimes call this a posteriori, but that's just a fancy word for arguments from experience. And as it so happens, we actually have quite a lot of documented experiences, not only from our own time, but from ancient times, about this sort of activity. He says, what says history? So, what's the historical experience? He says, Among modern nations, it's comparatively rare. In modern Rome, it's perhaps not very uncommon. In Paris, probably not quite so common. In London, less frequent. In Edinburgh or Amsterdam, you scarce hear of it 2 times in a century. But if we want to look for a place where there was plenty of this going on, ancient Greece and Rome, right? Even a lot of famous people that we know were engaged in this sort of thing, right? So that's where we should be looking. And he says, some people could be ashamed of what they looked at as an excess of it, or they might be ashamed of it as a weakness, as a propensity that had a tendency to distract men from more worthy and important occupations. But that doesn't actually apply directly to male-male sexual relationships. You can do the same thing with women. If you're a guy and you're not doing your job properly because you're always out there trying to get involved in sexual relationships with women, it's the same thing as with men. There's nothing specific about male-male sexual relationships in this case. And, it can be viewed as a weakness unbecoming to a philosopher, but they didn't view it as a turpitude or crime unbecoming to a man, right? What we do notice in ancient times, like he says, and he goes through a lot of examples that we don't need to look at, is that this propensity was universally predominant among the ancient Greeks and Romans and among the military as much as any. So what does that mean? Well, the experience shows it doesn't actually have debilitating effects. It doesn't actually weaken people universally. If the toughest guys in ancient Greece and Rome were getting it on with other guys and not feeling too bad about it, other than maybe it distracts them from things, it doesn't make them less, capable militarily or morally of doing their jobs, well, then that should tell us something about those relationships in the present, shouldn't it? It's not debilitating, even if people think it is. Then he considers another possible wrinkle. Well, what about if we modify the claim? It's not debilitating to the active, penetrating partner, but it is debilitating to the passive, penetrated partner. Maybe that's an argument that could be made. And he says, that's actually what Montesquieu is claiming. Is this an argument that holds? So he says, does this become a fixed disposition? Well, he says, wouldn't the patient be the agent in his turn? If it were not so, the person on whom he supposes the effects to be the greatest is precisely the person with regard to whom it's most difficult to conceive why those consequences should result. We don't see this in what's going on. And then he says once again, well, what does experience actually reveal? Did the ancient Greeks and Romans, where men were having sex with men, and one person was the passive partner and one person was the active partner, was the passive partner weakened physically or spiritually or intellectually? That doesn't turn out to be the case. And he's going to give you a whole bunch of examples of this. And he's also going to say, there's an important philosopher who you think would have been observing this, because he observed everything else available. If there had been this sort of effect, Aristotle would have talked about it, but he doesn't, right? And we find that, like he says, it's more of a social thing, right? It's viewed as degrading to be in the passive part. Why? Because you're ministering to the pleasure of another without participation. It's making yourself the property of another person. It's playing the woman's part, so it's regarded as unmanly. But that's the only thing that winds up being problematic about it. It's not that it makes you a weaker person. If that was the case, then Alcibiades, who was the passive partner, wouldn't have been a tough guy. And we know he was a tough guy, right? So he also talks about Julius Caesar, looked at as a man of tolerable courage in his day, notwithstanding the complaisance he showed in his youth to the king of Bithynia, Nicomedes. So, if you've got pretty important people who we think of as, quite masculine, not being unmanned by this, these arguments don't really hold. And these are the, more common arguments in Bentham's time that get used. So he's saying, these don't really give you a reason to persecute or prohibit or prosecute people for male-male sexual relationships.